They say empires rise with glory and fall with chaos, but that's not how it truly happens. History doesn't move in gentle circles. It strikes in patterns, sharp, exact, unforgiving. A design repeated across centuries, ending the mightiest nations long before their people ever felt the ground shifting beneath them. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Three empires that shaped the world, ruled trade, dominated oceans, yet all collapsed following the same hidden sequence, as if destiny itself had assigned them identical endings. And now, in 2025, the United States isn't drifting toward that sequence, it is already locked inside it. Not years away, not on the edge, deep into the very stages that ended every superpower before it. 5 steps completed, 2 steps left. And once those final stages begin, history shows the fall is not slow, it's sudden. This isn't fear-mongering, it isn't fantasy. It's the mathematics of power, and power that ignores the pattern never survives it. So the real question becomes, what happens when the strongest nation of the modern world reaches the point no empire has ever come back from? Every empire begins with the same quiet delusion, the belief that its power is permanent. Not because the evidence supports it, but because success is seductive. Wealth creates comfort. Comfort becomes confidence. And confidence, over time, hardens into something far more dangerous. The absolute certainty that decline is impossible. That the rules of history apply to everyone else, but not to you. Spain believed that. Britain believed that. The Soviet Union believed that. At their peaks, they had every reason to. Their economies were unmatched, their militaries feared, their currencies trusted more than gold itself. When you dominate the world, weakness feels like a foreign concept, something that happens to other nations in distant lands. But decline does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives disguised as stability. The first cracks are invisible. The first damage is psychological. Empires don't fall because they are weak, they fall because they believe they can't become weak. They fall because arrogance blinds them to the math unfolding beneath their feet. History's greatest collapses didn't begin with weakness, they began with certainty. If you strip away the flags, the cultures, the centuries, every fallen empire tells the same story. Not in poetry or myth, but in numbers, in deficits, in debts, in armies stretched too thin, in currencies pushed beyond their limits. A 7-stage pattern, repeating across time like a warning carved into stone. And once an empire enters this sequence, it does not skip stages. It does not reverse them. It moves forward, step by step, until the pattern is complete. It begins with military overextension, when a nation's ambitions stretch further than its resources. Then comes currency debasement, the quiet dilution of value as governments create money faster than they create wealth. After that, the debt spiral begins, borrowing to pay for yesterday's borrowing, building a tower of promises no economy can sustain. The 4th stage is the loss of productive capacity, when the nation stops building, innovating, and manufacturing, and starts importing everything it once made. The 5th is social decay division, distrust, stagnation, and the slow unraveling of civic unity. If those 5 stages unfold, 2 more follow with brutal inevitability, the loss of reserve currency status, and then the final collapse. 3 empires followed the sequence exactly, and the U.S. has already completed 5. Spain was the world's first true global superpower, a nation so rich, so vast, so unstoppable that Europeans believed its dominance would last forever. After the conquest of the Americas, ships began returning across the Atlantic loaded with a kind of wealth no kingdom had ever witnessed. Mountains of silver, rivers of gold, endless treasures carved out of lands thousands of miles away. By the mid-1500s, Spain wasn't just wealthy, it controlled the very flow of wealth itself. Its currency was accepted everywhere. Its influence stretched across continents. Its monarchs ruled with the confidence of men who believed God had placed the world in their hands. But hidden inside that abundance was the seed of collapse, because when wealth arrives too easily, discipline disappears just as easily. Spain mistook extraction for strength. It believed the treasure would never stop flowing. It believed having everything meant it could afford anything. And in that illusion, the first cracks formed. The empire wasn't building a sustainable economy, it was burning through a temporary fortune. Spain became the first warning to every future superpower. Unlimited wealth doesn't secure an empire. It erodes the very discipline needed to protect it. How does a nation with more silver than the world has ever seen go bankrupt? Spain's decline didn't begin with a sudden disaster, it began with momentum, with an empire racing forward faster than its foundations could carry. The silver pouring in from the Americas ignited a hunger for expansion that no amount of wealth could satisfy. Armies pushed across Europe, across the Mediterranean, across the New World. Spain wasn't managing an empire, it was chasing one. And every new frontier demanded more soldiers, more ships, more gold than the last. When taxes couldn't cover the cost, the crown turned to its currency. Coins that were once pure silver symbols of Spanish pride were quietly mixed with copper. At first, the change was almost invisible. But each adjustment weakened the real value of the money in people's hands. What looked like prosperity on the surface was masking a slow internal fracture. Prices drifted upward, merchants grew wary, trust in Spain's currency began to fade. And when debased coins still weren't enough, Spain began borrowing from Italian bankers, German financiers, and anyone willing to believe the empire's mines would never run dry. But they did. Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times in just 40 years. The richest empire in the world was drowning in debt. Trapped in a financial spiral it could no longer escape. King Philip II learned the truth too late. Every new coin Spain printed made the empire weaker. Spain's final decline wasn't dramatic at first. It wasn't a single war, or a single enemy, or a single decision. It was something quieter, slower, more corrosive. As silver shipments shrank and debts grew, Spain discovered a devastating truth. While it had been importing wealth, it had stopped creating it. The empire that once fed Europe with gold and silver now relied on Europe for everything else. Food, tools, ships, clothing, even the simplest goods, were no longer made at home. Why build when you can buy? Why innovate when treasure arrives in ships? But that treasure was running out. With mines depleting and debts piling up, Spain's economy began to rot from within. Crime rose, poverty spread, beggars filled the streets of Madrid. The people who produced value, merchants, craftsmen, thinkers, fled to places where innovation still mattered. The nation's best minds drifted toward France, England, the Netherlands. Spain was left with priests, soldiers, and bureaucrats, consumers, not creators. And when the silver finally dwindled, the illusion collapsed. The empire had grown large but hollow, powerful but empty, a giant made of gold-plated wood. What happens when a superpower realizes it produces nothing? Britain rose on a different kind of power, not sudden treasure, but structure, strategy, and reach. At its height, the British Empire stretched across a quarter of the planet. Oceans were not barriers. They were highways, patrolled by the strongest navy the world had ever seen. Traders, soldiers, administrators, and bankers moved under a single flag. And at the center of it all was the British pound, the currency every nation trusted, the financial heartbeat of global trade. If Spain ruled with silver, Britain ruled with systems. But beneath the confidence of a world-spanning empire, small fractures were already forming. The same pattern that consumed Spain was beginning again, hidden under centuries of success. Britain believed its dominance was permanent. It believed the pound would always be the world's reserve currency. It believed that the sun could not possibly set on an empire so vast, so stable, so disciplined. Yet the illusion was quietly unraveling. Wars were draining resources. Debt was tightening around the empire's neck. The cost of controlling India, the jewel of the empire, was rising faster than the wealth it produced. Britain still looked invincible on the map, but on the balance sheet, it was gasping for air. How does the strongest navy in history lose its empire without losing a war? Britain's unraveling didn't begin on the battlefield, it began in the balance sheets. After World War I, the empire faced a brutal truth. The pound was no longer as strong as Britain pretended it was. Gold reserves had been drained to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. Yet in 1925, Winston Churchill made a fateful decision. He put the pound back on the gold standard at its old, pre-war value. It was a gesture meant to signal strength, but it was strength Britain no longer possessed. The results were catastrophic. An overvalued currency strangled British exports. Factories slowed. Unemployment rose. The government was trapped, defending a currency that the world no longer believed in. By 1931, the illusion shattered. Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pound lost a quarter of its value almost overnight. And then came World War II, another tidal wave of spending. Britain didn't just fight the war, it mortgaged its future to survive it. Billions were borrowed from the United States, loans stacked upon loans. By the time the war ended, Britain owed more than its entire economy produced in a year. The empire had won the conflict, but lost its financial foundation. Churchill's gold decision had been a symbol of pride, but pride is expensive. And in Britain's case, it was fatal. What happens when the world stops believing your currency is worth what you claim it is? The British Empire didn't collapse in a single moment. It faded, piece by piece, territory by territory, as if the world were quietly reclaiming what Britain could no longer afford to hold. The end didn't come with a dramatic battle or a decisive surrender. It came with exhaustion, with debts that could never be repaid, with a currency that no longer anchored global trade, with a nation that had won the war, but lost the economic strength required to rule afterward. India was the first major fracture. The jewel of the empire slipped away in 1947, ending nearly 2 centuries of British rule. And once India left, a wave followed. Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, Jamaica, Pakistan, Nigeria. One by one, colonies demanded independence, or Britain simply no longer had the financial or military capacity to resist. It wasn't defeat, It was surrendered to arithmetic. By the 1970 seconds, the empire existed only in history books. The pound had fallen from its once towering value to a fraction of what it used to be. A global hegemon had become a junior partner to the United States, a nation still proud, still influential, but undeniably diminished. Every empire believes it has more time than it actually does. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was conquered. It didn't fall because its enemies were stronger. It fell because it built a military giant on top of an economic foundation made of sand. For decades, the USSR matched the United States tank for tank, missile for missile, satellite for satellite. On paper, it was the other superpower, the only nation capable of ending the world with the push of a button. But behind the steel and spectacle was an economy straining far beyond its limits. The Soviet model demanded that the state control everything: factories, farms, production, innovation. And under that system, nothing worked as well as the government claimed. Factories produced quantity, not quality. Farms harvested less food than a nation of that size required. Technology lagged behind the West by years, sometimes decades. But the military kept expanding anyway. The USSR was determined to match American influence everywhere, no matter the cost. Then came the Afghan War, the Soviet Union's own Vietnam, a conflict that drained money, morale, and legitimacy, a war the USSR could not afford, fought for reasons it could no longer justify. It exposed the cracks in the system, the weakness behind the power, the truth that military strength cannot compensate for economic fragility. And just like the empires before it, the Soviet Union discovered the cruel math of overextension. How does a nuclear superpower vanish in just 900 days? Beneath the surface of Soviet power, the economy was already collapsing in slow motion. Factories that once symbolized strength had become relics: massive, rusting structures producing goods nobody wanted at costs no nation could sustain, shelves emptied, lines for bread stretched for blocks. A country with some of the richest farmland on earth was importing grain just to feed its people. The ruble, the currency of a supposed superpower, was so worthless that even Soviet citizens preferred U.S. dollars when they could find them. Oil kept the system afloat for a while, the last lifeline of a dying empire. But when global oil prices fell in the 1980 seconds, the USSR's finances collapsed with them. Gold reserves drained, foreign currency vanished. The government could no longer buy what its own factories failed to produce. And the satellite states Poland, Hungary, East Germany sensed the weakness. One by one, they broke free, and the illusion of Soviet dominance shattered with them. Then the Berlin Wall fell. Overnight, the world saw what Soviet leaders had denied for decades. The superpower was hollow. A giant held together not by strength, but by fear, and fear was no longer enough. In 1991, the Soviet Union didn't crumble slowly. It imploded. No invasion, no decisive battle, just economic reality finally catching up. The ruble became worthless. The government couldn't pay salaries. The military couldn't function. A nuclear empire disappeared in 900 days. What happens when a superpower runs out of real money? When you lay the stories of Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union side by side, the illusion of uniqueness disappears. 3 empires, 3 eras, 3 completely different systems: monarchies, democracies, communist states. Yet each one followed the same 7 stages with chilling precision. The details changed, but the direction never did. Overextension, debased currency, rising debt, hollowed-out production, social fracture, loss of global trust, collapse. Spain drowned in silver, Britain drowned in war debt. The Soviet Union drowned in its own inefficiency. 3 different paths, 3 different ideologies, one identical destination. Because collapse isn't cultural, it isn't political, it's structural, it's mathematical. And math does not negotiate. Once an empire enters the sequence, the momentum is almost impossible to reverse. Not because the leaders don't see the danger, but because they see it too late. The collapse looks obvious only in hindsight. In the moment, every empire believes it has more time, more strength, more exceptions to the rule. But the pattern doesn't care about belief. If 3 different empires couldn't escape the pattern, why would the 4th? For decades, the United States has stood as the center of global power militarily, economically, culturally. Its influence reaches farther than Spain's galleons, Britain's navy, or the Soviet war machine ever could. American troops are stationed across the planet. The dollar underpins nearly every major trade. Technology, entertainment, innovation, all radiate outward from the U.S. like spokes from the hub of a wheel. On the surface, it looks unshakable, unmatched, permanent. But permanence is the first illusion of every empire. And beneath the surface, the same 7-stage pattern that consumed Spain, Britain, and the USSR is unfolding again, step by step, stage by stage. Not approaching, not beginning, already in motion. The U.S. has crossed the first 5 stages with startling accuracy. Military overextension? Achieved. Currency debasement? Recorded. A debt spiral climbing beyond comprehension? Underway. Productive capacity hollowed out? Visible in every import line. Social decay? Rising in every statistic measuring trust, unity, or stability. This isn't a warning about a distant future. It's an observation about the present. What if the collapse isn't coming because it's already underway? For the United States, the first 3 stages of the pattern didn't creep in quietly. They accelerated with breathtaking speed. The American military spans the planet with more than 750 bases in over 80 countries. Troops are deployed in regions most Americans will never see, defending alliances most Americans have never heard of. Each commitment adds another line to the ledger, another drain on resources, another promise the nation must somehow fund. Military might became military overextension, the same first stage that once pulled Spain, Britain, and the USSR into decline. And to fund this expanding reach, the U.S. did what every strained empire eventually does. It turned to its currency. Trillions of dollars were printed in just a few years. Not earned, not produced, printed. Money created faster than the economy could absorb, diluting the value of every dollar already in existence. The world's strongest currency was being stretched thinner and thinner, like a golden thread pulled beyond its strength. But printing wasn't enough. Borrowing filled the gap, massive, unprecedented borrowing. $36 trillion in national debt, $1 trillion a year just in interest payments. America is now borrowing money simply to pay the interest on the money it previously borrowed. A spiral, tightening month by month. This is the mathematics of decline. Not dramatic at first, but inevitable. What happens when the world's strongest currency becomes its most diluted? Stage 4 and Stage 5 are where a superpower begins to look strong on the outside and hollow on the inside. And in the United States, these stages didn't take centuries to unfold. They happened within a single generation. Factories that once powered the American century steel mills, auto plants, manufacturing hubs fell silent. Production moved overseas in pursuit of cheaper labor and higher margins. Entire industries that defined American strength were shipped out crate by crate, until the nation that once built the world now imported nearly everything it used to make. Medicines, electronics, machinery, even critical military components, all sourced from foreign supply chains the U.S. does not control. A superpower with global reach, suddenly dependent on rivals for the basics of its own survival. And as the economy hollowed out, society followed. Trust collapsed in government, in institutions, in each other. Cities frayed under the weight of homelessness and addiction. Families shrank, birth rates plummeted, political polarization turned neighbors into enemies. The national mood shifted from confidence to exhaustion, from unity to fracture. These aren't isolated issues. They are the unmistakable signs of Stage 5, social decay. From a distance, America still looks powerful. But when a nation stops producing and starts fracturing, the weakness becomes internal and visible at first, then undeniable. How does a superpower look strong on the outside, while rotting on the inside? Stage 6 is the moment every empire fears, because once it arrives, nothing can stop the fall. It's the loss of reserve currency status, the point where the world no longer depends on your money to function. And for a nation built on global financial dominance, it is the ultimate breaking point. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been the backbone of global trade. Nations bought oil in dollars, stored savings in dollars, built their financial systems around dollars. That privilege allowed America to spend far more than it earned, to borrow far more than it produced, and to print far more than any other nation could survive. The world needed dollars, so the dollar was untouchable. But that foundation is starting to shift. BRICS nations are building alternatives. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record levels. China and Russia are trading in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of petrodollar power, is accepting yuan for oil. Slowly, quietly, the global system is hedging against the dollar. This is how reserve currency loss begins. Not with a crash, but with subtle moves, nations diversifying, protecting themselves, preparing for a world where the U.S. is no longer the financial center. What happens when the world stops needing the dollar? Stage 7 is the moment every empire insists will never come until it does. Collapse is never slow. It doesn't unfold over comfortable decades. It happens the way a dam breaks, quietly at first, then all at once. The signs appear in the currency markets, in the bond markets, in the political temperature. Then the sequence hits a tipping point, and the fall accelerates with brutal speed. For centuries, people imagined Spain would dominate forever. Then the silver stopped, the debts piled up, and the empire disintegrated within a generation. Britain ruled a quarter of the earth until its currency faltered and its colonies slipped away in rapid succession. The Soviet Union looked unbreakable, a nuclear superpower, until its economy imploded and the nation dissolved in 900 days. Collapse doesn't look like Hollywood imagines. It doesn't begin with explosions. It begins with liquidity drying up, with a currency crisis that triggers a debt crisis, with a debt crisis that triggers a political crisis. Suddenly, the institutions that once looked eternal become paralyzed. Promises cannot be funded. Systems cannot be maintained. The world realigns as the fallen giant scrambles to regain balance. If the United States reaches stage 7, the shift will not be gentle. It will be fast, disorienting, and irreversible, because no empire has ever reversed the sequence once it is complete. If collapse comes in 900 days, would America even recognize itself afterward? When an empire approaches the end of the pattern, the future narrows into just a few possible paths, not infinite possibilities, only 3. Because once stages 1 through 5 are complete, the road ahead becomes a choice between levels of damage, not the avoidance of it. The first path is reform and stabilization. It is the rarest. It requires honesty, sacrifice, political unity, and a willingness to dismantle the system that created the crisis. Spain couldn't do it. Britain waited too long. The USSR never had the political flexibility to even attempt it. For the United States, this path would mean rebuilding industry, cutting commitments, reducing debt, restoring trust tasks that demand a level of national cohesion the country hasn't seen in decades. The second path is a partial collapse with restructuring. In this scenario, the old financial order breaks, but the country survives in a diminished form. New policies emerge from necessity, not choice. Standards of living fall, global influence contracts, but the nation continues smaller, weaker, but intact. And the third path is full systemic breakdown. A sudden implosion of currency, debt, and political stability. The kind that rewrites borders, governments, and identities. The kind history has shown again and again. Which path will America choose, and how much time is left? History is not emotional. It does not care who is strong, who is rich, who is proud, or who believes they are untouchable. History follows patterns, and those patterns follow math. And once the numbers turn against an empire, the countdown begins quietly, invisibly, inexorably. For Spain, the clock started when silver no longer masked its weaknesses. For Britain, it began when debts outweighed the empire's ability to sustain them. For the Soviet Union, it started when the economy could no longer support the illusion of strength. Each empire believed it had decades left. Each believed it would find a way out. Each believed the rules did not apply to them. Every one of them was wrong. The United States stands in the same place now, not at the beginning of the pattern, but deep inside it. 5 of the 7 stages complete. 2 more approaching. The window for change is narrowing, not widening. And the most dangerous belief any nation can hold is the belief that it still has time. Every empire believed, not us, until it was too late. The answers are not hidden in the future. They're written in the past. Every warning, every pattern, every consequence is already documented in the rise and fall of the empires that came before. And if you can see those patterns clearly, you can see exactly where the United States stands right now and what comes next if nothing changes. Because the truth is simple. Reserve currencies don't last forever. Debt spirals don't reverse themselves. Militaries stretched across the planet don't magically regain balance. And societies fractured from within don't heal without sacrifice. The pattern doesn't lie. It doesn't bend. It doesn't make exceptions for nations that call themselves exceptional. But it does warn those who are willing to look. If you want to understand each stage as it unfolds, not after, but before, subscribe. Because once the world enters stage 6 and 7, the shift will be fast, confusing, and irreversible. And you will want to understand exactly why it happened, how it happened, and what it means for the future you're about to live in. The pattern doesn't lie, but it does warn those willing to listen.